The second process is estimate costs. It's the process of developing an approximation of the monetary resources needed to complete all project activities. For each activity, we should identify any and all associated costs for labor, materials, equipment, services, and facilities, as well as special categories such as inflation allowance, cost of financing, and contingency costs. Cost estimates are a prediction based on the information known at a given point in time. This prediction includes the identification and consideration of costing alternatives to initiate and complete the project. As you go throughout the project, cost estimates should be reviewed and refined as additional details are gathered and assumptions are tested. Also, we should identify and consider cost alternatives and trade-offs, as well as risks on the project such as make versus buy versus lease, and the sharing of resources in order to achieve optimal costs for the project. Project estimates tend to become more accurate as the project progresses throughout the project lifecycle. For example, a project in the initiation phase may have a rough order of magnitude, often referred to as ROM estimate, in the range of -25% to +75%. During the planning phase, budget estimates can narrow the range of accuracy to -10% to +25%. Later in the project, during final user acceptance testing, you are much more confident in your estimate, so you create a definitive estimate, and the accuracy level should range from -5% to +10%. So, as you gather more information and become more involved in the project details, your estimates become more definite. The key inputs include the cost management plan, which defines how project costs will be managed and controlled on the project, and the level of accuracy required to estimate activity costs. This process also requires the human resource management plan that provides project staffing requirements and personnel rates, which are necessary components for developing the project cost estimates. The scope baseline is also an input, and remember this includes the scope statement, WBS, and WBS dictionary. Two final inputs to review here: the project schedule and risk register. The project schedule will indicate the type and quantity of resources and the amount of time which those resources are applied to complete the work of the project. These are important factors in determining the project cost. The risk register will also be helpful since it will show all the risks, particularly the ones we view as threats or opportunities, and any associated risk response costs. The estimate cost process has quite a list of tools and techniques, as you can see here. The first is expert judgment, as we can and should take advantage of any knowledge we have gained in prior projects and apply it in this process. This could include methods of estimating costs and how to reconcile differences between them. With analogous estimating, we use the actual cost of a previous similar project as the basis for estimating the cost of the current project. Obviously, this approach is less costly and less time-consuming, but it is also generally less accurate. It tends to be more reliable when the previous projects are similar in fact and not just in appearance. It's often used for an initial estimate at the beginning of the project when little information is available. Let's review parametric estimating, which involves using a statistical relationship between historical data and other variables in unit value form to calculate cost estimates. For example, in a previous project, it cost $100 to develop one web page, so it will cost $400 to develop 4 web pages. When you hear the word parametric, I want you to think of mathematical calculations. Detailed costs are then summarized or rolled up to higher levels for subsequent reporting and tracking purposes. 3-point estimating can be beneficial in that it can help to improve the accuracy of activity cost estimates by using 3 values to define an approximate range for an activity's cost. The idea is to come up with an expected cost estimate using a weighted average of 3 estimates, namely pessimistic, most likely, and optimistic. Bottom-up estimating involves estimating the cost of individual work packages or individual schedule activities with the greatest level of specified detail. Reserve analysis is a tool and technique here because sometimes we may have to establish cost reserves for unknown situations. There are two types, including contingency reserves and management reserves. Contingency reserves are reserves attributed to identified project risks that you know will occur, also referred to as known unknowns, in other words, accepted risks. For example, you may have a contingency reserve for project staff lacking skills in a certain technology you're implementing. Note that contingency reserves are part of the cost performance baseline. Management reserves are for risks that have not been identified, also referred to as unknown unknowns. Unfortunately, most projects are hit by unidentified risks, so management reserves serve as a source of protection. The project manager may be required to obtain approval before obligating or spending management reserves. Management reserves are not a part of the project cost baseline, but they are included in the overall project budget. Regardless of the type of reserve, some organizations have standards set for the amount of funds they allow as a buffer, as well as taking into consideration the type and level of risk. Cost of quality involves determining the costs associated with conforming to the quality requirements of the project. The last tool and technique I want to cover is vendor bid analysis. One way to estimate costs is to look at what the project should cost by obtaining and reviewing bids from qualified vendors. For example, you plan to buy 10 computers for the project, so you ask vendors to submit bids. The cost estimates you receive from the vendors can help you in developing a realistic cost estimate for the project. The key outputs in the estimate cost process are activity cost estimates and basis of estimates. Activity cost estimates are quantitative assessments of the probable costs required to complete project work. All of the activities to be completed on the project should have associated costs such as direct labor, materials, equipment, services, facilities, information technology, and special categories such as cost of financing and inflation allowance and exchange rates. These costs need to be identified and calculated for each activity. By basis of estimates, we mean those additional necessary details that support the cost estimate. We have to provide supporting documents that provide a clear and complete understanding of how the cost estimates were derived.